For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. Last month, one of Graham Hancock's regular contributors posted an article on his website that attacked Milo Rossi, better known as Mini-Minuteman. Most of my regular viewers know who he is. His series Debunking Ancient Apocalypse, Hancock's Netflix show, is, I think, the most watched critique of ancient apocalypse on the internet. So it is no surprise that he is now being attacked personally by Hancock's cadre. Hancock posted a link to Skinner's ad hominem article, saying, "Thanks to brilliant freelance researcher Holly Lasko Skinner, who I've worked with for many years, for looking into this phenomenon at a time when my energies have been focused elsewhere." Since Skinner's article refers to me numerous times, using my words to attack Mini-Minuteman, and misunderstands things that I've said, I think I ought to correct the record. In this video, I want to look specifically at Holly Lasko Skinner's argument that Milo Rossi, Mini-Minuteman, is a pseudoarchaeologist. According to my definition, he isn't. I made a whole video defining what pseudoarchaeology is, and if you haven't seen it yet, I recommend watching it. I made the video because I noticed there was a great deal of misunderstanding about what pseudoarchaeology is. To make it as clear as I possibly could, I even included illustrative skits to drive the point home. Skinner watched it, and it went over her head. I realize it is possible that she is motivated not to understand it, but it's also possible I still wasn't clear enough, so I hope this video will rectify that situation. Skinner spends the first part of her article showing that Milo currently calls himself an archaeologist. Then she refers to a live stream that I did in June of 2022, in which Milo appeared, and he said this:
I don't know what to label myself as, because it make me feel like a fraud to say that I am an archaeologist when I have like a training in it. I haven't been out on a dig, so it's like, I don't want to like claim that, when in reality that title requires a lot of, research and a lot of time and investment in order to say that. So I'm just like, I'm Milo. I talk about this stuff. You guys know I've been researching it, my whole life. I'm a researcher, yes. But like, I don't feel the need to like make up some title to try and make myself sound like I'm, I don't know, better than I am.
So here Milo says that he doesn't feel comfortable calling himself an archaeologist. Skinner concludes that there's a contradiction. She writes, "As evidenced in Chapter 1, Milo Rossi, aka Minuteman, is on record stating that he is an archaeologist. He is not an archaeologist because he hasn't been adequately trained. If he were to call himself an archaeologist, he'd feel like a fraud." Did you catch the mistake? She writes that Milo said he is not an archaeologist because he has not been adequately trained. Is that what he said? Let's play the clip again.
I have like a training in it. I haven't been out on a dig,
He said it would make him feel like a fraud to say he is an archaeologist when, although he does have the training in it, he hasn't been out on a dig. This is her first major blunder. I expect that since our live stream, Milo considered that there is more to being an archaeologist than simply being out on a dig, and so he changed his mind about calling himself one. I do know that when he was in field school, it was during COVID, so they had to replace hands-on work in the field with data work. It was good enough for the school, but not good enough for Skinner. She then makes an argument about what she thinks a pseudo-archaeologist is. She does this by looking up the word pseudo in the dictionary. Then she extrapolates. You might wonder, if she was simply going to use the dictionary, why didn't she just look up pseudoarchaeology? It could be because she didn't like the definition. The Oxford Dictionary defines pseudoarchaeology as a broad spectrum of largely unconnected topics and approaches which misapply, misinterpret, and misrepresent archaeological material in a non-scientific and often speculative way. I think that's a fine definition. She probably disagrees, so she made her own. Here's how she extrapolates from the word pseudo. By logical deduction, a preliminary definition of a pseudoarchaeologist is, therefore, an inauthentic, not genuine, fake archaeologist, someone who calls themselves an archaeologist when they lack adequate qualifications or training, a sham. Her first definition is inadequate because it focuses on the qualifications or training rather than on the methods, and it is the methods that determine whether someone is a pseudoarchaeologist. Someone who calls themselves an archaeologist to make it seem like they're an authority on archaeology when they're not, pretentious. The second one describes a mere poser or imposter, which is not what a pseudoarchaeologist is. The opposite of a real archaeologist, who possesses the title archaeologist because they not only possess adequate qualifications or training, but also follow the scientific method that the discipline prescribes. The third one comes closest to getting it right because it at least includes the method, but it puts too much emphasis on the title. Someone who imitates or resembles an archaeologist by applying methods to human material remains that are unique to archaeology practice, rather than another practice like history or environmental science. In the last one, I object to the term unique. Various disciplines have overlapping practices. It is the combination of the methods that make it part and parcel of archaeology, not the fact that it is employed only in archaeology. So I would change the word unique to instrumental. But then, it still doesn't say what the pseudo part of it is. It requires more than imitating an archaeologist to be a pseudo-archaeologist. You need to do the archaeology wrong. I don't think any of these captures the essence of what a pseudo-archaeologist is. Then she talks about my video on the definition of pseudo-archaeology, and she says I contradict myself. First, she refers to this clip. Now, what if a person formulates a hypothesis and devises a model, but fails to collect all the necessary data, neglects to conduct experiments, and doesn't test the hypothesis against more data? Is that person practicing archaeology? If they fail to perform all the steps, no. They can be great at the speculative phase of archaeology, the creative part of it. They can dabble a bit in the data, even doing a small measure of analysis on a small number of artifacts. But if their data falls far short of what is needed for the subject, or if their experimentation is sorely lacking, in other words, they don't even come close to performing the necessary work, they're not practicing archaeology. They are, in fact, doing pseudo-archaeology. And then she compares it to this clip. Someone might say, well, it can only be called pseudo-archaeology if the person is claiming to be doing archaeology. What about cases when a person is drawing conclusions without ever calling themselves an archaeologist? If the person is making claims about the past, using material remains as evidence, they are performing the same function as an archaeologist. Just as a person who offers medical advice is performing the same function as a physician. I don't see any contradiction between my two statements. But what does she say about it? This statement about the functions of an archaeologist begs two questions. Is it true that if a person makes claims about the past using material remains as evidence, they are performing the same function as an archaeologist by default? The answer is that it depends on how they are using the material. So, for example, if someone examines tool marks on a piece of stone in order to determine what kind of tool was used, this is behaving as an archaeologist. Or if someone uses the stratigraphy of a site to draw conclusions about the relative ages of the material remains there, this is behaving as an archaeologist. Or if someone uses archaeoastronomy to determine the age of a site, this is behaving like an archaeologist. Or if someone carbon dates some object in order to determine its age, this is behaving like an archaeologist. Yes, all of these are practices within the field of archaeology. A pseudo-archaeologist might do one or more of these things. It's just that in the process of doing these things, they violate scientific principles. Is it true that if a person advises someone about a medical matter, they are performing the same function as a physician by default? In other words, is a person who isn't a physician and who medically advises another who's suffering with a medical condition by default a pseudo-physician? The answer is the same. It depends on if this person is using tools and materials in a way that mimics that of a physician. Or is a person who isn't an archaeologist and who makes claims about the past using material remains as evidence, by default, a pseudo-archaeologist. Again, it depends. If they are doing archaeology correctly, then they are not a pseudo-archaeologist. But if they are violating scientific and archaeological principles while doing so, then they are a pseudo-archaeologist. Remember what I said in the clip above. They don't merely have to imitate archaeologists. In my example, I said they also fail to collect all the necessary data, neglect to conduct experiments, and test the hypothesis against more data. Right? A pseudoarchaeologist only imitates an archaeologist on the surface. They don't actually do the archaeological work properly. Of course not, because the prefix pseudo is more nuanced than that, and so are the definitions of archaeologist and physician. You see, the problem here is that she is continuing to use a stipulative definition of pseudoarchaeology, discarding the commonly accepted meaning in favor of an altered use, one that breaks up the term into its constituent parts, to support her case. If a person calls themselves a physician, or pretends to be one when they're not, then they're no doubt a pseudo-physician because they've not been trained to follow the methods and processes undertaken by qualified physicians, and they're deceiving the person that they're advising. No, this is not what a pseudo-physician is. And this is strange because I gave an example in the video of a pseudo-surgeon, and it is very clear that it has nothing to do with what the person calls themselves. It has to do with their methods only. If the person attempts to treat someone medically, and they use the wrong methods, only then are they a pseudo-physician. If, however, it's already known that the person is not a physician, or if they state, "I'm not a physician, but this worked for me, so you could explore it as a possibility," then they're not a pseudo-physician. They're someone who's giving medical advice. That's right. If no attempt is made to treat the person or prescribe medicine to a person, then they are not a pseudo-physician. In a similar vein, the scientific method that Dr. Miano states archaeologists must abide by to practice archaeology rather than pseudo-archaeology, formulating a hypothesis, devising a model, collecting data, conducting experiments, and testing the hypothesis with more data, is not the same function as interpreting the past by using results obtained by archaeologists. On this, she is correct. Simply relaying to someone else what archaeologists have already found is not engaging in pseudo-archaeology. But I would add that the interpretation of archaeological data is part of the profession of archaeology. And if one dismisses the interpretation of archaeologists in favor of their own interpretation, which ignores the archaeological method for interpreting data in favor of a personal method for doing so, this could be construed as pseudo-archaeology. For example, if archaeologists provide a set of carbon dates, and someone else picks and chooses which carbon dates they wish to believe and dismisses other ones, not based on scientific method, but on personal wishes, this person is engaging in pseudo-archaeology and pseudoscience. She continues, as explored earlier, interpretation of the past without scientific experimentation is an art, humanity, or social science, and can be undertaken by historians or journalists, as well as archaeologists. Historians interpret the past more often than the present, whereas journalists interpret the present more often than the past. Dr. Miano, who possesses the title ancient historian, is qualified to interpret the past for this very reason. According to his logic, he'd be a pseudo-archaeologist otherwise. I generally do not interpret archaeological data. I allow the archaeologists to do that, because they know what they're doing. I simply relay what they have found to others. Have there been instances where I disagree with archaeologists over an archaeological matter? I don't think so. There have been instances where I favor one interpretation over another when the jury is still out, but I have never said I know more than archaeologists about archaeology. If I did disagree with archaeologists, and I violated archaeological principles to come up with an interpretation different from theirs, then yes, you could say I was doing pseudo-archaeology. She continues, logic follows that if a person doesn't claim to or attempt to obtain results from human material remains, which is exclusively the job of an archaeologist, and instead claims to interpret the past by using results obtained by archaeologists, they're not practicing fake archaeology, but something else, and the label pseudo-archaeologist should not apply. That doesn't follow my logic. If a person uses pseudo-archaeological methods, they are not practicing something else. They are practicing pseudo-archaeology. Now she attempts to apply her logic to MINIMINUTEMAN. If, however, a person does claim to be an archaeologist, Yet they have not followed the scientific method prescribed by the institution of archaeology that distinguishes it from other disciplines like history or journalism, then they could justifiably be referred to as a pseudo-archaeologist, a fake archaeologist. The whole idea of distinguishing it from other disciplines is irrelevant, because archaeology uses scientific methods from other disciplines. But notice here that she is arguing that if you don't follow the method, even once, you can justifiably be called a pseudo-archaeologist. And she tries to use me as an authority on this point by clipping this statement of mine. If a person reaches a conclusion that is in harmony with the mainstream consensus of history, but doesn't engage in the process scientifically, that person is doing pseudo-archaeology. The word pseudo-archaeology has nothing to do with whether a theory is correct. It's not the what that matters, it's the how. And so, measuring an object poorly or incompletely, failing to take into account all the evidence on the subject, and drawing far-reaching conclusions from it, is pseudo-archaeology. She then gives the example of Milo's video on the Baghdad battery, and then shows how archaeologist Dr. Brad Hafford corrected him on a few points. She draws this conclusion. In other words, Rossi assessed the artifacts poorly and failed to take all of the necessary information on the topic into account, thus creating a confusion of information and an incomplete and inaccurate analysis of the topic. Such is Dr. Miano's statement about what constitutes pseudo-archaeology. Holly should think about what she is saying a little bit more. Does she really believe that archaeologists cannot make errors? Or if they do, they are no longer an archaeologist, but a pseudo-archaeologist? Or is she merely saying that I think that? Well, I don't think that. To use myself as an example, I am behaving as a historian when I do history by using the historical method. I am behaving as a pseudo-historian when I do history by violating the historical method. In fact, someone can rightly say, "You are doing pseudo-history" in that instance. They wouldn't really call me a pseudo-historian, though, unless this was what I commonly do. Similarly, I wouldn't call someone a pseudo-archaeologist unless they commonly practiced pseudo-archaeology. But I question the very idea that Mini-Minuteman was doing pseudo-archaeology at all in this case. There's a difference between making mistakes and doing fake archaeology. Nevertheless, Skinner tries to make it seem that way. To summarize, Dr. Hafford's main criticisms of Rossi's interpretation of the Baghdad battery, albeit in more direct language than his own. 1. Rossi does not find enough evidence to suggest that the artifacts could have been batteries because he did not look for or use the archaeological primary data and instead uses spurious secondary sources. 2. Since Rossi failed to use the archaeological data, he misunderstood the artifacts. 3. Since Rossi misunderstood the artifacts, he misrepresents the leading interpretation by archaeologists, which is, contrary to Rossi's claims, sufficiently evidenced. 4. Rossi misinforms his viewers about the artifact and various interpretations of it. In other words, Rossi's data collection falls far short of what is needed for the subject, and he doesn't come close to performing the necessary work. Such is also Dr. Miano's definition of what constitutes pseudo-archaeology. Keep in mind here that this Baghdad battery information was difficult to find. The subject matter is not well documented, and I commend Dr. Hafford for digging deep and finding what he could. But Skinner really tries to make it sound like Mini-Minuteman's sins were egregious, even listing it as 4 points. He not only didn't find the evidence, he failed to use the evidence he didn't find. And he misunderstood the artifacts because he didn't find the evidence, and he also misinformed his viewers because he didn't find it. She's just listing the same one problem in 4 different ways. But in none of this did he actually practice pseudo-archaeology. Not finding information is a mistake. It's not pseudo-archaeology. Another thing she doesn't take into account is whether someone acknowledges an error, or whether they stick to their guns. In this case, Rossi admitted he made a mistake. This generally is not the behavior of a pseudo-archaeologist. That's pretty much all I wanted to say about the matter. Skinner misuses my words, but I expect this was simply because she didn't understand them, and a motivation to smear Mini-Minuteman may have been a factor as well. But I hope, dear viewer, that I at least helped to clear up any misunderstanding that you may have had, if you did have any. Pseudoarchaeology has nothing to do with what someone calls themselves. It's about mimicking the practice of archaeology while violating its principles and methods. And someone is a pseudoarchaeologist if they do this commonly. Thank you for watching. If you like what this channel is doing and would like to help support it, you can become a patron for as little as $2 per month at patreon.com/World of Antiquity. Or if you want to give just a one-time donation, you can do that here on YouTube as a super thanks. You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world. You might also wish to use it to help spread the word. So feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.